I don't think it makes sense to include Jessica this year. My cousin's voice cut through the Zoom call, sharp and dismissive. I froze, fingers hovering over my keyboard as 20 family members pretended not to notice I was still on the screen. The resort has a certain standard. She might feel out of place with her situation. The words hung in the digital space between us, a perfect crystallization of 15 years of judgment wrapped in fake concern. I said nothing as they continued planning the family reunion at a venue they assumed I couldn't afford, never suspecting that 8 months earlier, I had signed the papers making me the majority owner of Lakeside Pines Resort. I simply smiled, made a polite excuse, and disconnected from the call. They had no idea that the girl they were excluding would be signing their welcome cards when they arrived. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jessica Carter, though my family has always called me just Jessica. The subtle difference between a name and a dismissal that only those who've been minimized can truly understand. I grew up watching my worth being calculated through a very specific lens. The car I drove, the labels I wore, the numbers in a bank account no one had actually seen. I was the daughter of Susan Miller, who had committed the unforgivable sin of marrying a man who prioritized passion over profit, and subsequently divorced him when his musical ambitions led to financial instability. In the Miller family hierarchy, this placed me firmly at the bottom, the cautionary tale referenced in hushed tones. Study hard or you'll end up like Cousin Jessica, they'd tell their children, as though my life was the tragic conclusion to a morality play about poor choices. The reality couldn't have been more different. I still remember the day I decided to stop explaining myself to people who weren't genuinely curious about my life. It was my grandmother's funeral 3 years ago. We stood around her grave, ostensibly, united in grief, but segregated by the invisible lines that family members draw between themselves. My cousins Megan and Taylor stood clustered with their parents, my Uncle Dave and Aunt Ellen, all dressed in designer mourning wear that somehow still managed to signal status even in a cemetery. I hung back slightly, dressed in a simple black dress from a department store, not because I couldn't afford better, but because spending hundreds on something to wear to a funeral seemed wasteful to me. As we walked back to our cars, I overheard Megan whispering to Taylor, gesturing toward my 6-year-old Honda. She couldn't even get a nice rental car for Grandma's funeral, she said with practiced dismay that didn't quite hide her satisfaction. Some people just don't understand priorities. They both laughed, not realizing I was right behind them. In that moment, something crystallized within me. The hurt that had been my constant companion at family gatherings transformed into something more powerful: clarity. These people would never see me, not the real me, because their vision was too clouded by brand names and status symbols. And suddenly, I realized I didn't care anymore. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need to justify my choices. The freedom in that realization was intoxicating. What my family never saw, what they never bothered to ask about, was the life I had actually built for myself. They knew I worked at some nonprofit, a career choice they interpreted as proof of my impractical nature and inability to succeed in the real world. What they didn't know was that I was the executive director of the Northeastern Community Development Foundation, one of the largest philanthropic organizations in the region. My role connected me with wealthy donors, community leaders, and investment, opportunities that most people would never access. They saw my apartment in the city as evidence that I couldn't afford a real home, not recognizing that my choice reflected preference, not limitation. My spacious downtown loft with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline cost more than Uncle Dave's suburban McMansion, though I'd never pointed this out. I chose urban life for its energy, walkability, and proximity to work. Values, completely foreign to a family that measured success exclusively in square footage and acreage. They noted my lack of vacation photos on social media as confirmation of my financial struggles. never considering that I traveled extensively, but chose to experience places rather than document them for others' approval. While cousin Megan posed in front of tourist attractions in designer outfits, I was building relationships with local artisans in Morocco, hiking remote trails in New Zealand, and volunteering at marine conservation projects in the Galapagos. Most significantly, they never knew about my investments. While working 80-hour weeks at the foundation, I had built a substantial real estate portfolio, starting small and gradually expanding. I lived comfortably but well below my means, reinvesting most of my income. I didn't flaunt my successes or post about my acquisitions. I built in silence, finding satisfaction in the growth rather than the recognition. By 33, I owned several commercial properties, had shares in 2 successful restaurant groups, and most recently had acquired Lakeside Pines Resort through my investment company, Blue Summit Holdings. The 200-acre property with its Grand Lodge, 20 luxury cabins, and pristine lakefront had been underperforming for years due to mismanagement. I saw the potential where others saw decline, and with 2 silent partners, purchased it for $8 million, investing another $3 million in renovations. None of my family knew this. They continued to see me as poor Jessica with her charity job and practical car, never imagining that I could buy most of their homes with a single check. And I let them believe it, not out of shame, but out of a growing understanding that their misconceptions gave me freedom. Their underestimation was actually a gift. It meant no one came to me for loans, asked for connections, or expected financial support. The irony wasn't lost on me when I received the email from my resort manager about the Miller family reunion booking. For a moment, I considered declining the reservation, but that felt petty and unprofessional. Instead, I simply instructed the staff to treat them like any other guests. I would be on site that weekend for business purposes anyway, staying in my private cabin overlooking the lake. I had no plans for a dramatic revelation. In fact, I intended to avoid them entirely, focusing on meetings with architects about the upcoming expansion project. But life rarely follows our careful plans, especially when family is involved. The reunion weekend arrived with perfect July weather. From my cabin on the hillside, I watched my family members check in throughout Friday afternoon. Uncle Dave immediately headed to the boat dock, examining the vintage wooden boats we'd restored as part of the renovation. Aunt Ellen made a beeline for the spa, while my cousins Taylor and Megan spent nearly an hour taking photos on the grand lakeside staircase we'd rebuilt, tagging the resort in their Instagram posts. My mother arrived last, looking uncomfortable among her wealthier relatives. She had remarried a kind, middle-class teacher named Robert years ago, a choice that had somewhat lowered her status in the family hierarchy. I made a mental note to invite her and Robert to dinner at my cabin later in the weekend. She, at least, deserved to know the truth. Saturday morning found me in the main lodge's restaurant, seated with my back to the dining room as I reviewed blueprints with our architect. We were discussing the planned expansion of the spa facilities when I heard a familiar voice. "Jessica?" I turned to see my mother standing beside our table, confusion written across her face. "What are you doing here? I thought you couldn't. I mean, we assumed you weren't coming." I smiled and stood to hug her. "I'm just here for work, Mom." "Work?" She glanced at the blueprints spread across the table. "You work here at the resort?" Before I could answer, Uncle Dave approached with Aunt Ellen close behind. Cousin Taylor, ever alert to potential drama, wasn't far behind, pulling Megan away from her breakfast to join us. "Well, this is a surprise," Uncle Dave said with forced joviality. "Your mother said you couldn't make it this weekend. Did you change your mind?" There was an undercurrent to his question, a subtle reminder that this place was supposedly out of my budget. Taylor and Megan exchanged knowing looks, no doubt assuming I had scraped together enough money to join them after all. Or perhaps was crashing in someone else's room. The architect, sensing the tension, gathered his documents. "I'll incorporate those changes and get back to you next week, Ms. Carter. The expansion should really elevate the property's value. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm sorry. I should have defended you more. It wasn't your responsibility, I replied. And honestly, their underestimation gave me freedom. No expectations, no pressure, no family looking for handouts or connections. We talked for nearly 2 hours. Really talked, perhaps for the first time in years, about how appearances had always mattered too much in our family, about how my father's financial failures had shaped both our places in the family hierarchy, about how I'd learned to find value in privacy and purpose rather than in displays of wealth. Robert and I always wondered how you afforded that apartment in the city, she admitted. We worried about you. I laughed. Mom, I bought that building 3 years ago. Her shocked expression was priceless. The entire building. It was a good investment. The neighborhood was gentrifying, and the previous owner didn't recognize the potential. She shook her head, smiling despite herself. My daughter, the secret real estate mogul. Not so secret anymore, I suppose. As we finished lunch, she asked hesitantly, Will you join us for dinner tonight? The whole family will be there. I considered declining, but recognized the olive branch for what it was. I'll be there, but don't expect me to be any different than I've always been. I think I'm finally starting to see who you've always been, she replied. By evening, the news had spread through the entire family. As I entered the private dining room we had reserved for their reunion dinner, conversations halted abruptly. All eyes turned to me, and I experienced a moment of déjà vu. So many family gatherings had started exactly this way with my arrival, causing a ripple of awkward silence. The difference was in what followed. Instead of quickly resuming previous conversations and effectively ignoring me, suddenly everyone wanted my attention. Uncle Dave pulled out the chair beside him. Aunt, Ellen asked about the wine selection, and my cousins watched me with a mixture of curiosity and calculation. Jessica, come sit with us, Taylor called, patting the seat next to her. We were just saying how amazing the resort is. The renovations must have been extensive. I smiled politely, but chose a seat beside my mother and Robert instead. Thank God. You. We're quite proud of how it turned out. Throughout dinner, the questions came rapid fire, thinly disguised attempts to recalibrate their understanding of my place in the world, and by extension, their relationship to me. So, Blue Summit. Holdings, is that just the resort, or do you have other properties? Uncle Dave asked with studied casualness. Several, I answered vaguely, turning to compliment the chef who had come out to check on our meal. Have you always been interested in real estate? Aunt Ellen probed. I never knew. There's a lot we never knew about Jessica, my mother interjected with a pointed look that made Ellen flush slightly. Megan, never one for subtlety, cut to the chase. So, exactly how successful are you? Like, millionaire successful or what? Megan, her father admonished, though I could see the same question in his eyes. I set down my fork and looked around the table. I appreciate the sudden interest in my career, but I didn't join dinner to discuss my finances. I've never asked any of you about your bank accounts, and I'd prefer the same courtesy. The silence that followed was telling. Then Robert, my stepfather, cleared his throat. I'd rather hear about the community programs your foundation has been developing. Susan mentioned something about urban gardens? I shot him a grateful look. Yes, we've established 12 community gardens in food deserts across the city. The project employs formerly incarcerated individuals and provides fresh produce to neighborhoods without grocery access. As I described the program, I noticed the varied reactions around the table. Robert and my mother listened with genuine interest. Uncle Dave seemed to be calculating whether there was any profit angle. Taylor appeared bored, while Megan kept glancing at my watch, trying to determine its brand and value. The dynamics hadn't changed, only their perception of my place within them had shifted. They still measured worth the same way. I was simply higher on their scale now. It was both amusing and sad. Later, as dessert was being served, Taylor leaned across the table. "You must know everyone who's anyone in the city through your foundation work. My boyfriend is trying to break into investment banking. Perhaps you could introduce him to some of your donors?" Before I could respond, Megan jumped in. "And if you're ever looking to expand your marketing for the resort, that's literally my specialty. I could give you family rates." Uncle Dave wasn't far behind. "You know, Jessica, I've been looking at some investment opportunities that would be perfect for someone like you. We should talk." One by one, they revealed themselves, not interested in who I was, but in what I could now do for them. The realization was illuminating, but not surprising. It simply confirmed what I had always suspected. Their measure of a person had never been about character, only about utility. "I don't mix family and business," I said calmly, addressing all of them. "It's a personal policy." Their disappointed expressions might have hurt me once. Now they merely confirmed. I had made the right choice in keeping my success private for so long. As the evening wound down, I excused myself, citing an early meeting the next day. My mother hugged me tightly at the door. "You handled that beautifully," she whispered. "I'm so proud of the woman you've become." "I've been this person all along," I reminded her gently. "Nothing's changed about me." "I know that now," she said. "But I think I'm finally seeing you clearly." Back in my cabin, I stood on the deck overlooking the moonlit lake. From this vantage point, the resort lights twinkled below, and I could see the main lodge where my family continued their reunion without me. They looked small from this distance, their expensive outfits and practiced laughter insignificant against the backdrop of ancient trees and starlit water. I felt no triumph in their discomfort, no satisfaction in their scramble to recalibrate their understanding of me. Their opinion, whether dismissive or suddenly admiring, held no power over my sense of self-worth. That had been the real transformation. Not becoming successful, but realizing that their approval had never been the goal. The journey hadn't been about proving them wrong. It had been about building a life that felt right to me. About creating wealth with purpose, success with meaning, and a future secured by my own efforts rather than anyone's approval. As I sipped my tea and watched the night sky, I realized that the greatest luxury wasn't owning this resort or any other property. It was the freedom to define success on my own terms, to move through the world without seeking permission or validation, to know my own worth so deeply that no one could diminish it with a dismissive comment or belittling assumption. The irony wasn't lost on me. They had excluded me from their gathering because they thought I couldn't afford the venue, never suspecting that I owned not just the building, but the very ground beneath their feet. But the greater irony was that their exclusion, and all the years of underestimation that preceded it, had given me the independence to build something they couldn't have imagined. Sometimes being underestimated is the greatest advantage. It allows you to work without scrutiny, succeed without interference, and build without constraints. The people who dismiss you inadvertently give you the gift of invisibility, and in that space, away from their limiting expectations, you can become exactly who you're meant to be. I didn't need to own the venue to prove my worth, but there was a certain poetry in the fact that I did. The days following the revelation at Lakeside Pines unfolded like a strange dream. I returned to the city on Sunday evening, leaving my family to complete their reunion weekend without me. The quiet of my downtown apartment felt like a sanctuary after the emotional turbulence of those unexpected confrontations. I hadn't planned to expose my financial reality to them, had actually gone to considerable lengths over the years to keep it private. But now that the truth was out, I found myself curious about what would happen next. I didn't have to wait long to find out. Monday morning brought a flood of messages, each one more transparent than the last in its sudden interest in my life and accomplishments. Uncle Dave's text arrived first. Jessica, I've been thinking about our conversation. I'd love to hear more about your business ventures over lunch. I have some investment opportunities that might interest someone with your acumen. I had to smile at the irony. This was the same uncle who had advised me 3 years ago to find a real job with benefits because my nonprofit work was admirable but impractical. Now he saw me as a potential investor rather than a cautionary tale. Aunt Ellen's message was equally revealing. Darling, we need to catch up properly. I always knew you were destined for great things. Are you free for tea at the Windsor next weekend? My treat, of course. The Windsor was the city's most exclusive hotel, a place she had previously deemed unnecessarily extravagant when I once mentioned meeting a foundation donor there. The shift in her perception was almost comical. My cousins were even less subtle. Taylor wanted career advice for her boyfriend. Megan offered her marketing services at family rates, while not so discreetly inquiring about my net worth. Even distant relatives who had barely acknowledged my existence at family gatherings were suddenly finding reasons to connect. I responded to none of them. It wasn't spite that kept me silent. It was a deep weariness with the transactional nature of their interest. They didn't want to know me, the person I had always been. They simply wanted access to resources they had only just discovered I possessed. The only message I answered was my mother's. When you're ready, Robert and I would love to have dinner. No agenda, no questions, just family. We arranged to meet that Friday at their modest home in the suburbs. I drove my reliable Honda, dressed in my usual simple attire, and brought a bottle of wine that was expensive but not ostentatious. Some habits of discretion remained, even now. Their house was exactly as I remembered, comfortable, slightly cluttered, filled with books and mementos rather than status symbols. My mother embraced me at the door, holding on a moment longer than usual. "It's still just me, Mom," I said gently. "Nothing's changed." She pulled back, studying my face. "Everything's changed. Or rather, my understanding has changed." Robert greeted me with his typical warmth, but without the undercurrent of concern I'd often sensed before. The worry that his stepdaughter was struggling financially while too proud to accept help. Now that he knew the truth, there was something like amused respect in his eyes. Over homemade lasagna and the wine I'd brought, we talked. Really talked, beyond the surface-level updates that had characterized our relationship for years. My mother wanted to understand the journey I'd kept hidden, and for the first time, I felt ready to share it. "It started with necessity," I explained, twirling pasta on my fork. "When I graduated with student loans and took a nonprofit job, the family assumptions about my finances weren't actually wrong. I was struggling." "We would have helped," my mother interjected. "I know, but I needed to figure it out myself." I described my first tiny apartment, the strict budget, the side gigs that helped me stay afloat while building experience at the foundation. What everyone missed was how quickly things changed once I got promoted to Director of Development. I told them about my first investment opportunity, a small apartment building near the university that a foundation donor mentioned was being sold in a distress sale. How I'd scraped together a down payment, lived in one unit, and rented out the others. How I'd learned about property management, tenant laws, and renovation costs through hands-on experience. I sold it 18 months later for nearly double what I paid, I said. That was the beginning. Robert leaned forward, genuinely interested. "And you never told anyone? Not even us?" I looked at my mother, choosing my words carefully. By then, I'd noticed how the family treated people differently based on their financial status. How Uncle Dave dominated conversations because he was the successful one. How Aunt Ellen's opinions suddenly mattered more after Uncle Jim's promotion. How my cousins were valued for their vacations and purchases rather than their character. My mother's eyes filled with tears of recognition. And you didn't want that kind of conditional respect. Exactly. Once I realized my success was growing beyond what the family would expect, I made a conscious decision to keep it private. It started as self-protection but became almost an experiment. How would they treat me if they thought I had nothing they wanted? The answer had been clear and consistent for years, with dismissal, condescension, and occasional pity. The contrast between that treatment and the flurry of messages I'd received since the revelation at the resort couldn't have been more stark. "I'm ashamed we never saw past our assumptions," my mother said quietly. "That I never did." I reached for her hand. "You were caught in the same value system, and I didn't make it easy to see the truth." We talked late into the evening about how perceptions shape relationships, about the freedom I'd found in building a life outside the family's narrow definition of success, about the complex emotions surrounding my accidental revelation. As I was leaving, my mother asked the question I'd been expecting. "Will you come to Thanksgiving this year? Everyone will be at Ellen's house." I hesitated. I'm not interested in being the family curiosity or financial advisor. "I understand." She hugged me. "But remember, some of us just want you there because you're you, the same Jessica you've always been." That night, driving back to my apartment, I reflected on the irony of my situation. For years, I had maintained an emotional distance from my extended family, seeing their conditional acceptance for what it was. Now that the circumstances had changed, I had the power to reject or rebuild those relationships on my terms. The question was whether any of them were worth the effort. The weeks that followed brought more messages, then fewer as it became clear I wasn't responding to transparent attempts to leverage our newfound connection. Instead of feeling vindicated by their discomfort, I found myself strangely detached. Their opinion, previously something I had protected myself against, now seemed almost irrelevant to my sense of self. I returned to my normal routine, demanding work at the foundation, carefully considered investment decisions, quiet evenings in my apartment overlooking the city. The only difference was that I no longer needed to compartmentalize these aspects of my life. The energy previously devoted to maintaining separation could now be directed elsewhere. One unexpected outcome was my deepening relationship with my mother and Robert. Free from the weight of half-truths and omissions, our conversations became more authentic. They visited my apartment for the first time, expressed genuine interest in my work at the foundation, and shared their own financial concerns without the previous awkwardness. "We always thought we needed to worry about you," my mother confessed during one visit. "It's taking some adjustment to realize you're actually more financially secure than we are." This led to a new dynamic I hadn't anticipated: the opportunity to help them without drawing attention to the disparity in our situations. When their furnace failed that October, I arranged for a replacement presented as a foundation donor connection, rather than an outright gift. When Robert mentioned concerns about their retirement savings, I connected them with my financial advisor while privately ensuring they received priority service. These quiet interventions brought me more satisfaction than any ostentatious display of wealth ever could. They were acts of genuine care rather than status signaling, the difference between who my family had taught me to be and who I had chosen to become. As Thanksgiving approached, I wavered on my mother's invitation. Part of me wanted to maintain the boundaries I'd established. Another part was curious to see how family dynamics had evolved since the revelation. In the end, I decided to make an appearance, not to flaunt my success or seek validation, but to observe and decide whether any of these relationships were worth preserving. I arrived at Aunt Ellen's suburban home 30 minutes after the stated dinner time, a deliberate choice to minimize pre-meal small talk. The house was much as I remembered from previous gatherings, large but not luxurious, decorated with careful attention to current trends without crossing into genuine style. The kind of home that announced its owners were doing well without revealing exactly how well. The hush that fell over the gathering as I entered was telling. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Eyes darted between my face and my simple outfit, no doubt searching for signs of the wealth they now knew existed, but couldn't quite locate in my appearance. I carried a bottle of wine worth more than some of their car payments, but only a true connoisseur would recognize the understated label. "Jessica!" Aunt Ellen rushed forward with unprecedented warmth, air-kissing both my cheeks. "We weren't sure you'd make it. Come in, come in." Uncle Dave appeared at her side, hand extended. "Great to see you, Jess. We need to catch up." I smiled politely, accepting their greetings while noting the subtle shifts in their demeanor. The condescension had vanished, replaced by an eager deference that was equally inauthentic. My mother caught my eye from across the room and gave me a small, understanding smile. The seating arrangement at dinner told its own story. In previous years, I had been relegated to the far end of the table, or even the kids' table, well into my adulthood. This year, I found myself positioned prominently near the head of the table, between Uncle Dave and Cousin Taylor's investment banker boyfriend, whom I was clearly meant to network with. The conversation swirled around typical family topics: health concerns, workplace gossip, neighborhood news, but with frequent detours designed to elicit information about my financial situation. Uncle Dave mentioned his golf club membership with a sideways glance to gauge my reaction. Aunt Ellen described her recent renovation challenges, pausing expectantly as though awaiting property management advice. Taylor's boyfriend awkwardly worked his firm's name into unrelated discussions. I participated pleasantly in the general conversation while sidestepping these clumsy attempts at financial reconnaissance. When the pumpkin pie was served, Uncle Dave finally abandoned subtlety. "So, Jessica," he said, setting down his fork, "we're all dying to know. How exactly did you end up owning a luxury resort without any of us knowing? That's not exactly a small achievement to keep quiet." All pretense of other conversations ceased. The table's attention fixed on me with an intensity that would have once made me uncomfortable. Now I simply took a sip of wine, considering my response. "The same way anyone builds anything worthwhile," I replied evenly. "One step at a time, with focus and without fanfare." "But surely you must have had help," Aunt Ellen pressed. "Financial backing or connections through the foundation?" The implication was clear. They couldn't reconcile my success with their perception of my capabilities. Even now, knowing what I had accomplished, they searched for external factors to explain it away. "No," I said simply. "I started small, lived below my means, and reinvested consistently. The foundation work connected me with opportunities, certainly, but the capital was mine, built through careful decisions over many years." "But why keep it secret?" Taylor asked, genuine confusion in her voice. "I would have told everyone." This, perhaps more than anything, highlighted the fundamental difference in our perspectives. For Taylor, achievement existed primarily as social currency. For me, it had always been about creating security and meaning on my terms. "I didn't keep it secret exactly," I clarified. "I simply didn't broadcast it. The distinction matters." "Still," Uncle Dave persisted, "family should know these things. We could have celebrated your successes." The hypocrisy was so blatant I almost laughed. Instead, I looked directly at him. "Would you have? When was the last time anyone at this table asked me a substantive question about my work or my life? When was the last time my achievements, even the ones you did know about, were deemed worth celebrating?" An uncomfortable silence descended on the table. My mother reached for Robert's hand under the table, a subtle gesture of support I wasn't meant to notice. "That's not fair," Megan protested. "We always ask how you're doing." "You ask if I'm still at that nonprofit or still in that apartment," I corrected gently. You've never asked what my work actually involves or why it matters to me. You've never expressed interest in my life beyond confirming it still aligns with your assumptions. Another silence, heavier this time. We didn't know, Aunt Ellen said finally. We thought we knew who you were. You knew exactly who I am, I replied. You just assigned a value to that person based on metrics that never mattered to me. My career choices, my spending habits, my priorities. They've always reflected my actual values. The only thing that's changed is your perception of their worth. The discomfort around the table was palpable. I hadn't raised my voice or used harsh language, but the simple truth felt more cutting than any accusation. In that moment, I realized I wasn't angry anymore, just tired of the pretense. I didn't come here to make anyone uncomfortable, I said, softening my tone. And I'm not interested in dwelling on the past. I'm simply suggesting that if we want authentic relationships moving forward, they need to be built on something more substantial than financial status, whether perceived or actual. The conversation gradually shifted to safer topics, but something had fundamentally changed. A certain performance had been interrupted, a script abandoned. No one quite knew how to proceed without the familiar dynamics that had governed our interactions for so long. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the back porch with my cousin Taylor. Unlike the others, she had fallen uncharacteristically quiet after our dinner table exchange. Now, leaning against the railing in the November chill, she seemed to be working up to something. Was I really that terrible to you? She finally asked, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I considered her question carefully. Not terrible, just disinterested in who I actually was. You had a story about me, the struggling cousin, with impractical ideals, and it was easier to maintain that narrative than to know the real person. She nodded slowly. I never thought about it that way. It was just how we always talked about you. I know. And that's precisely why I never corrected anyone's assumptions. The story you all had about me revealed much more about all of you than it did about me. Taylor was quiet for a long moment. I don't think I really know who I am without my stuff, she finally admitted. The cars, the vacations, the promotions. That's how I've always defined myself. How everyone in this family has defined themselves. Her unexpected vulnerability caught me off guard. This was the most authentic conversation we'd ever had. That's the real tragedy of measuring worth through possessions, I said gently. Eventually, you forget there's a difference between what you have and who you are. She met my eyes, and for a moment, I glimpsed something like recognition, as though she were truly seeing me for the first time. How did you avoid that trap? You grew up in this family too. I thought about it. Necessity, at first. When I couldn't compete on those terms, I had to find value elsewhere. Later, it became a choice. The freedom I found in being underestimated was worth more than any validation based on false metrics. I think I've spent my whole life being afraid of being underestimated, she said quietly. Maybe that's something worth examining. We stood in companionable silence for a while, watching our breath cloud in the cool air. When we eventually returned inside, something had shifted between us. Not friendship exactly, but a mutual recognition that hadn't existed before. As I prepared to leave, the goodbyes were awkward, but less performative than the greetings had been. Uncle Dave attempted one more time to schedule a business lunch, which I deflected with practiced ease. Aunt Ellen hugged me with genuine warmth rather than social obligation. My mother promised to call the next day. Driving home, I reflected on the evening with mixed emotions. There had been no dramatic reconciliation, no tearful apologies, or profound family healing. Reality rarely provides such tidy resolutions. What had happened instead was perhaps more valuable, a disruption of established patterns, an introduction of authenticity into relationships long governed by superficial values. I didn't harbor illusions that one dinner would transform my family's fundamental worldview. Years of measuring worth through material success couldn't be undone in a single evening, but small cracks had appeared in the facade, and in those cracks, something new might eventually grow. Back in my apartment, I kicked off my shoes and made tea, taking it out to my balcony despite the November chill. The city lights spread before me, thousands of windows illuminating thousands of stories I would never know. Somewhere in those lights were people facing their own family dynamics, their own struggles to be seen for who they truly were. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Proud of you tonight. Not for what you've built, but for who you've become. Love you." I smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with financial success or family approval. The journey from being excluded from a family reunion to owning the venue had never really been about proving anyone wrong. It had been about discovering the freedom that comes from defining success on your own terms. The reunion venue, my investment portfolio, my career achievements, these were simply the tangible outcomes of choices made authentically, independent of others' expectations. The true victory wasn't in the revelation that shocked my family, but in the person I had become while they weren't paying attention. Someone who understood that worth isn't determined by others' perceptions, whether those perceptions undervalue or overvalue you. As winter descended on the city, my relationship with my extended family settled into a new pattern. The initial flurry of interest in my financial situation gradually subsided as it became clear I wasn't interested in becoming the family patron or investment advisor. Without that transactional potential, many simply reverted to their previous disinterest, albeit with slightly more respectful phrasing. I was comfortable with this distance. It confirmed what I had long suspected. The sudden attention had never been about genuine connection or regret for past dismissals. It had been about access to resources they had only just discovered I possessed. There were exceptions, however. My mother and Robert became regular visitors to my apartment, our relationship deepening as we moved beyond the constraints of old assumptions. Taylor reached out occasionally with surprisingly thoughtful questions about finding purpose beyond material success. Even Uncle Dave, after several rejected lunch invitations, eventually sent a message that hinted at genuine reflection. "Your comments at Thanksgiving have given me a lot to think about. I'm not sure I like what I'm seeing." These small shifts weren't dramatic transformations, but they represented something authentic, tiny acknowledgments that perhaps the values that had governed our family for so long deserved reconsideration. I held these developments lightly, neither expecting too much nor dismissing their potential significance. As the year drew to a close, I received an unexpected email from the general manager at Lakeside Pines. "Ms. Carter, the Miller family, has requested to book the resort for their summer reunion again next year. Given the circumstances of their last visit, I wanted to confirm whether you'd like us to accept the reservation. Respectfully, James Wilson." I smiled at the manager's diplomatic phrasing. He had witnessed enough of the dramatic revelation to understand the complexity of the situation. After considering for a moment, I replied, "James, please accept the reservation under normal terms. Family dynamics aside, they were good guests. Also, please ensure that the new East cabins are completed by then, the ones overlooking the sunrise. Reserve cabin 12 for my mother and her husband." "Thank you, Jessica Carter." The East cabins were our premium accommodations, positioned to catch the dawn light over the mountains, the most beautiful view on the property. My mother had always been an early riser who loved watching the sunrise. It was a small gesture, but one that recognized her genuine effort to see beyond the family's limiting perspectives. As for the others, they would receive exactly the same professional service as any other guests. No special treatment, no petty restrictions. Just the opportunity to enjoy a beautiful resort that happened to be owned by someone they had once deemed unworthy of invitation. There was a certain poetry in that arrangement. not as revenge or vindication, but as a quiet reminder that success isn't always visible and worth isn't always recognized, but both exist nonetheless. The family that had banned me from their reunion for being poor would return to a venue I owned, not because I had anything to prove, but because I had nothing to prove. In that freedom lay the greatest success of all, the ability to move through the world on my own terms, unbound by others' limited perceptions. I closed my laptop and turned back to the work that truly mattered. A foundation grant proposal for urban education initiatives, investment research for a sustainable housing development, plans for a community arts space in a neglected neighborhood. These were the projects that gave my wealth meaning beyond accumulation, that connected financial success to genuine impact. The family reunion would come and go. The dynamics might shift slightly or remain fundamentally unchanged. Either way, I would continue building a life aligned with my values, seen or unseen, understood or misunderstood, invited or excluded. Because I had learned the most valuable lesson: true worth is never determined by those who fail to see it. It exists independently of recognition, quietly growing in the spaces between others' assumptions, until one day it simply cannot be ignored. The next family reunion would be different, not because I had changed, but because I had finally allowed them to see who I had been all along. Whether that vision transformed their perspective was up to them. My own journey would continue regardless, confident, purposeful, and anchored in the knowledge that sometimes being underestimated is the greatest gift one can receive. Spring arrived in the city with a burst of cherry blossoms and renewal. 6 months had passed since the revelation at Lakeside Pines, and life had settled into a new rhythm. I had expected the family drama to fade into background noise as everyone returned to their regular patterns, but certain unexpected changes persisted. My mother and Robert had become regular fixtures in my life. Our Sunday brunches evolved from slightly awkward attempts at deeper connection to genuine enjoyment of each other's company. They had visited Lakeside Pines twice during the off-season, staying in the cabin I kept reserved for personal use. Those quiet weekends by the lake had done more to repair our relationship than years of holiday gatherings ever could. "We're thinking of retiring early," my mother mentioned one Sunday as we lingered over coffee on my balcony. The spring sunshine illuminated her face, making her look younger than her 58 years. "Robert's school has a buyout option this year. It wouldn't be much, but combined with our savings." She trailed off, and I recognized the mixture of hope and uncertainty in her expression. Robert had been teaching high school science for nearly 30 years, his passion for education, never quite matched by the compensation. "That sounds wonderful," I said, genuinely pleased for them. "Any thoughts on what you'd do?" Robert leaned forward, animated in a way I rarely saw him. "We've been talking about opening a small bookstore. Nothing fancy, just a neighborhood place with good coffee and reading nooks. Susan could run book clubs, and I could do science workshops for kids." The joy in his voice was unmistakable. This was clearly a long-held dream, not a recent whim. "The numbers are tight," my mother added, her practical side emerging. "Property, costs being what they are. But we found a space in Oakwood that might work if we stretch a bit." Oakwood was a charming suburb about 30 minutes from the city, known for its tree-lined streets and community feel. I could easily picture them there, building a quiet life centered around books and community rather than status and accumulation. "I happen to know something about commercial real estate," I said with a smile. "Would you like me to look at the numbers with you?" The relief on their faces was immediate. "Would you?" We didn't want to impose, but having your expertise would be incredible. I nodded, already making mental calculations. I could easily help secure favorable financing through my banking connections, or even become a silent partner in their venture. But I knew them well enough to understand that outright financial assistance would undermine their sense of accomplishment. What they needed was guidance, not charity. Send me the listing and your business plan. Let's see what we can figure out. As they left that afternoon, my mother hugged me tightly. Thank you for not making this weird, she whispered. I knew exactly what she meant. Our financial situations had essentially reversed from what they had been during my childhood, creating potential awkwardness. She had once been the parent helping her struggling daughter. Now I was the successful one, with resources to share. That role reversal could easily have strained our relationship without the mutual respect we had developed. It's never weird to help family who value you for the right reasons, I replied. That evening, I reviewed the materials they sent. The bookstore plan was thoughtful and realistic, if modestly scaled. The property they had identified was slightly overpriced but had excellent potential. Corner location, good foot traffic, charming historical details. With some negotiation and smart financing, it could work. I made a few calls to contacts in commercial lending and scheduled a meeting with my attorney to discuss partnership structures that would allow me to contribute capital while preserving their operational independence. By morning, I had outlined 3 potential approaches, each respecting their agency while improving their chances of success. This was the kind of family support that felt authentic, using my resources and knowledge to help them pursue their own dreams rather than imposing my vision or extracting social capital in return. It stood in stark contrast to the transactional relationships that dominated our extended family dynamics. Speaking of which, the annual Miller family reunion was now just 8 weeks away. True to their word, they had rebooked Lakeside Pines, this time with full knowledge of my ownership. The reservation showed 23 family members attending, slightly more than last year. Apparently, my newfound status had made the event more appealing to some of the peripheral relatives who had previously declined. James, the resort manager, had kept me updated on the special requests coming in from various family members. Uncle Dave had asked about upgrading to the premium cabin at the owner's family rate. Aunt Ellen had inquired whether the resort could accommodate her newly developed dietary restrictions. Cousin Megan had contacted the events team 3 times about using the grand staircase for a professional family photo shoot. I had instructed the staff to handle these requests exactly as they would for any other guests, with professional courtesy, standard pricing, and no special treatment. I had no intention of using the resort as either a power play or a peace offering. It was simply a business, and they were simply customers. My phone buzzed with a text from Taylor. Heard you're launching a new boutique hotel downtown. Any chance? For a tour before it opens. Promise not to steal design ideas for my apartment. This was typical of our revised relationship, friendly but still tinged with ulterior motives. The downtown hotel project was indeed underway, a historic building being transformed into an arts-focused boutique accommodation. But we hadn't made any public announcements yet. Taylor's inside information was clearly an attempt to demonstrate her connection to me. I replied simply, still in early development. We'll keep you posted if we do pre-opening events. Her response came quickly. Great. BTW, did you get my email about Jason's friend who's looking for investors for his tech startup? Could be the next Uber. And there it was, the real purpose behind the casual check-in. I didn't bother responding. These transparent attempts at leveraging our family connection for financial gain had become so predictable they were almost amusing. What Taylor and the others still failed to understand was that my success hadn't come from connections or shortcuts. It had been built methodically through education, disciplined investing, and genuine passion for community development. No hastily conceived startup pitched through family channels would ever interest me, regardless of its alleged potential to be the next Uber. The following week brought an unexpected invitation. Uncle Dave was celebrating his 60th birthday with a small gathering at his country club. The invitation arrived via expensive cardstock rather than the family group chat, a clear signal that this was meant to be a prestigious event. More surprising was the handwritten note at the bottom. "Jessica, would mean a lot to have you there. Dave." My initial instinct was to decline. Uncle Dave had been particularly dismissive of my career choices over the years, never missing an opportunity to contrast my non-profit work with his corporate achievements. His sudden interest in my presence coincided suspiciously with his knowledge of my financial success. And yet, something about the handwritten note gave me pause. It lacked the polished networking tone he typically employed. There was an almost awkward sincerity to it that seemed out of character. After some consideration, I decided to attend, not out of family obligation or curiosity about his motives, but as a small experiment in boundary setting. I would go as myself, the same person I had always been, and observe whether any authentic connection was possible now that the family's perception of me had changed. The country club was exactly what one would expect. Manicured grounds, understated luxury, staff trained to be simultaneously attentive and invisible. I arrived precisely on time, dressed in a simple but well-tailored navy dress that reflected my actual style rather than any attempt to impress. The gathering was larger than the invitation had suggested, at least 50 people mingling on the terrace overlooking the golf course. I recognized family members interspersed with what appeared to be business associates and club friends. Conspicuous displays of wealth abounded: designer outfits, strategic name-dropping, subtle competitions disguised as casual conversation. "Jessica!" Uncle Dave spotted me immediately, breaking away from a conversation to approach. "You made it. Thank you for coming." His greeting seemed genuinely pleased rather than performatively enthusiastic. I noticed he had aged since I'd last seen him at Thanksgiving. More gray in his hair, deeper lines around his eyes. "Happy birthday, Uncle Dave," I said, handing him a small, carefully chosen gift. It was a first-edition copy of a business book he had once mentioned influenced his early career. Something thoughtful, but not extravagant. He seemed momentarily surprised by the personal nature of the gift. "You remembered that conversation? That must have been years ago." 10 years, I confirmed. "At Grandma's 75th birthday. You were telling my cousin about books that shaped your thinking." He studied me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I didn't think anyone was listening. "I've always listened," I said simply. "That's different from agreeing." A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, or regret, crossed his face before he was pulled away by other guests. I moved through the party at my own pace, exchanging pleasantries with relatives and declining 3 separate introductions to brilliant young entrepreneurs with exciting investment opportunities. An hour into the event, I found a quiet spot on the edge of the terrace, content to observe the social dynamics unfolding before me. The familiar family patterns were evident even in this expanded setting. Aunt Ellen orchestrating conversations to highlight her children's achievements, cousins Megan and Taylor positioned strategically near the wealthiest-looking guests, various relatives performing the careful dance of implied success. Not your scene, is it? I turned to find Uncle Dave beside me, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. He offered one to me. "Thank you," I said, accepting the drink. "And no, not particularly. But family is family." He nodded, looking out over the party rather than at me. I used to think I needed all this. The right club membership, the right contacts, the right address. Spent 40 years building it. The uncharacteristic reflectiveness in his tone caught me off guard. "Having second thoughts?" I asked. He took a long sip of his whiskey. "Let's just say turning 60 makes a man reconsider what success actually means. Had a health scare? Last month? Nothing serious in the end, but enough to make me think." This was news to me. "I'm sorry to hear that. I didn't know." Kept it quiet. Didn't want it becoming family gossip. He glanced at me. "You understand that better than most, I think. The value of privacy." I nodded, sensing we were approaching something resembling an authentic conversation, perhaps the first we'd ever had. "Jessica, I owe you an apology." The words seemed difficult for him to articulate. "I've been dismissive of your choices for years. Treated you like you were naive or unsuccessful because you didn't follow the path I understood." I remained silent, allowing him space to continue. "When I found out about your business success, my first reaction wasn't admiration. It was confusion. I couldn't reconcile the Jessica I thought I knew with someone capable of building what you've built. That says more about my limitations than yours." The admission clearly cost him something. Uncle Dave had built his identity around being the family's business authority, the one whose financial opinions went unquestioned. "Thank you for saying that," I replied carefully. "But I'm curious, would you have come to this realization if you hadn't discovered my financial situation? Would my work at the foundation ever have seemed valuable on its own terms?" He considered this with surprising thoughtfulness. "Honestly, probably not. My generation measures worth pretty narrowly." He swirled the whiskey in his glass. "It took seeing success I recognized to make me question why I hadn't valued what I didn't recognize." There was a refreshing candor in his self-assessment. No justification, no deflection, just acknowledgement of a limited perspective. "The irony," I said, "is that the skills that built my portfolio came directly from the work you dismissed. Community development taught me to see potential where others didn't. Nonprofit management made me resourceful with limited capital. Foundation relationships opened doors to investment opportunities most people never hear about." He nodded slowly. "Success that doesn't follow the expected path makes people uncomfortable, challenges their assumptions." A rueful smile crossed his face. "I've spent decades being absolutely certain about what works and what doesn't. Maybe I should have asked more questions instead." We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the party continue below us. It wasn't a dramatic reconciliation or a complete bridging of our differences, but it was something I hadn't expected. A genuine acknowledgement from the family patriarch that his measuring stick might have been flawed. "So what now?" he finally asked. "You've built this impressive business quietly. Planning to expand? Take on partners? Go public eventually?" I smiled at the familiar territory. Business talk was his comfort zone. None of the above, actually. I'm focused on sustainable growth with meaningful impact. The new boutique hotel downtown will showcase local artists and provide apprenticeships for community college students. The resort is implementing environmental initiatives that actually improve our bottom line. It's possible to do well financially while doing good in other ways. And that's enough for you? No interest in maximizing potential returns? I'm already wealthy beyond what I need for personal security and comfort, I explained. Additional wealth only matters if it creates additional meaning. Otherwise, it's just numbers on a statement. He seemed to genuinely consider this perspective. I've never thought of it that way. Always assumed more was better, period. Different values lead to different definitions of success, I said, simply. As the evening progressed, I found myself engaged in surprisingly substantive conversations with various family members. Something about Uncle Dave's more reflective mood seemed to have shifted the atmosphere slightly, creating space for interactions beyond the usual status signaling. My mother noticed it too. As we prepared to leave, she squeezed my arm and whispered, "Something's different tonight. You've changed the energy somehow." I shook my head. Not me. I'm exactly the same person I've always been. Maybe they're just finally seeing it. Driving home that night, I reflected on the subtle shift in family dynamics. Uncle Dave's unexpected moment of self-awareness. Taylor's genuinely interested questions about the foundation's work. Aunt Ellen's admission that she'd been thinking about volunteering somewhere meaningful. These weren't dramatic transformations, but they represented tiny cracks in the value system that had defined our family for generations. I harbored no illusions that one evening had fundamentally changed deeply ingrained perspectives. Real change rarely works that way. But perhaps the revelation of my success had created an opening, not because financial achievement suddenly made my opinions worthwhile, but because it had disrupted their assumptions enough to create space for new possibilities. The upcoming family reunion at Lakeside Pines would be a more significant test. Away from the structured environment of a birthday party, would these nascent changes persist? Or would the family revert to established patterns once the initial shock of my revelation had fully worn off? I found myself curious rather than anxious about the prospect. Whatever happened, I had established a new equilibrium in my relationship with the extended family. They could no longer dismiss me outright, nor could they easily extract the financial benefits they had initially hoped for when discovering my wealth. That left the possibility, however slim, of relationships based on something more authentic than status or utility. In the weeks leading up to the reunion, I focused on my mother and Robert's bookstore project. After reviewing several potential structures, we had settled on a straightforward approach. I would provide a private loan at favorable terms, secured by the business, but structured to ensure they maintained complete operational control. The arrangement respected their independence while giving them access to capital they couldn't have secured through traditional channels. We found a better property than their original target, a charming corner storefront with an apartment above it, allowing them to live and work in the same location. The previous owner was retiring after 30 years running a knitting shop and preferred selling to someone who would maintain the building's character rather than convert it to generic retail space. My mother cried when we finalized the purchase. "I never thought this would actually happen," she admitted as we toured the empty space, already envisioning shelves and reading nooks. "We talked about it for so many years, but it always seemed like something other people got to do, not us." "You deserve this," I told her. "Both of you. You've spent your lives helping others, Robert shaping students' futures, you supporting Dad's dreams, and then rebuilding after he left. It's your turn now." She looked around the space with wonder. "Will you help us design it? You have such a good eye." "Of course, but it's your vision we'll be creating, not mine." This project had become a healing process for us, a way to collaborate as equals, each bringing different strengths to a shared goal. My financial resources and business experience complemented their creative vision and community connections. For perhaps the first time in our relationship, the power dynamic felt truly balanced. As we worked together on the bookstore, I found myself reflecting on how different this felt from my interactions with the extended family. Here, wealth was simply a tool for creating something meaningful rather than a measure of personal worth. Financial success was relevant only insofar as it enabled purpose-driven action, not as a status marker or point of comparison. This was the relationship with money I had deliberately cultivated in my own life, seeing it as a means rather than an end, valuable for the possibilities it created rather than the status it conferred. Working with my mother and Robert on their dream project only reinforced the wisdom of this perspective. The day before the family reunion, I visited Lakeside Pines to check on preparations. The resort looked magnificent in the early summer sunshine. Flower gardens bloomed along the winding paths. The lake sparkled in the distance, and the newly completed east cabins stood ready to welcome guests with their panoramic sunrise views. James met me in the main lodge, efficiency personified as always. "Everything is prepared according to standard protocols, Ms. Carter. The Miller family begins arriving tomorrow afternoon." "Thank you, James. Any special requests I should know?" "About." He consulted his tablet. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Mr. David Miller requested cabin 8 again. Ms. Ellen Miller inquired about spa appointments. We've handled everything according to our usual procedures." I nodded, pleased that the family seemed to have accepted they would receive the same excellent service as any other guests, no more, no less. "And my mother's cabin?" "Cabin 12 is prepared as requested. The welcome basket includes the local honey and tea she enjoyed during her last visit. This small personal touch reflected not preferential treatment, but the resort's standard practice of noting and remembering regular guests' preferences. My mother was being recognized as a valued visitor in her own right, not merely as the owner's parent. Perfect. I'll be staying in my usual cabin starting tomorrow. Please ensure the staff understands I'm here primarily as a guest this weekend, not in a managerial capacity. As I finished my inspection and prepared to leave, I paused on the grand lakeside staircase, the same spot where my cousins had posed for Instagram photos during last year's reunion, unaware that I owned the ground beneath their feet. So much had changed since then. Yet, in fundamental ways, nothing had changed at all. I was still the same person with the same values and priorities. My family was still navigating their own complex relationship with success and status. The difference was simply that a certain fiction had been dispelled, creating space for potentially more authentic connections. Whether those connections would actually materialize remained to be seen. But as I looked out over the peaceful lake, I found myself open to the possibility in a way I hadn't been before. Not because I needed their approval or acceptance, but because genuine relationships, even imperfect ones, held their own value in a life well lived. The reunion would begin tomorrow. 23 family members would arrive, carrying their expectations, insecurities, and newfound awareness of who I actually was. What unfolded over the weekend would reveal whether the small shifts I had observed in recent months represented meaningful change or merely temporary adjustments to an unexpected reality. Either way, I was prepared. Not with strategies or defenses, but with the quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly who I was and what mattered to me. The family that had once excluded me for being poor would gather at my resort not because I had engineered a moment of vindication, but because life sometimes creates its own perfect poetry. And in that poetry, the unexpected circles that bring us back to transformed versions of familiar places lay the possibility of new beginnings. Not dramatic Hollywood reconciliations or complete family transformations, but small human moments of genuine connection that might, over time, create something worth preserving. As I left the resort, I felt a sense of calm anticipation. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. I would move through it as myself, neither hiding my success nor flaunting it, neither seeking approval nor holding grudges. Simply present, as the person I had always been, finally visible perhaps, to eyes that had never truly seen before. The morning of the reunion dawned with perfect blue skies, as if nature itself had decided to showcase Lakeside Pines at its most magnificent. I woke early in my private cabin, a modern structure of glass and sustainable timber perched on the hillside overlooking the water. The large windows framed the mist rising off the lake as the first golden rays of sunlight pierced through the pines. This peaceful moment of solitude felt like the calm before a storm, though I wasn't entirely sure what kind of storm to expect. I dressed with deliberate neutrality, quality clothes that expressed my personal style without broadcasting their cost. No designer logos, no statement jewelry, nothing that screamed either wealth or its deliberate downplaying. Just me, as I had always been, regardless of who was looking. Over coffee on my deck, I reviewed some foundation documents for an upcoming board meeting. The work had become even more meaningful since my financial revelation to the family. There was a certain freedom in no longer needing to defend my career choice as anything other than what it was, a deliberate, fulfilling path that happened to align with my values. The foundation's current focus on educational equity and affordable housing initiatives reflected my belief that true community development required addressing systemic barriers, not just symptoms. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "Just checked in. This place is even more beautiful than last time. Cabin 12 is spectacular. Robert is already planning to spend the whole day on that deck with his book. When should we expect you?" I smiled, appreciating her excitement. "Already here in my cabin. Thought I'd give everyone time to settle in before making an appearance. Dinner tonight? Her response came quickly. Perfect, the family welcome. Dinner is at 6 in the Lakeside Pavilion. Your presence would make quite an entrance. The hint of mischief in her message made me laugh. My mother had developed an unexpected playful streak since our relationship had evolved beyond the constraints of old assumptions. She wasn't suggesting I make a dramatic appearance to prove anything. She simply understood the inherent theatrical potential of the situation. We'll see, I replied. Enjoy your day. The sunrise trail behind your cabin leads to a hidden waterfall if Robert gets restless. I spent the morning working remotely, periodically glancing out the window as cars began arriving at the main lodge. From my elevated position, I could see the familiar ritual of family members emerging with luggage, taking obligatory photos on the grand entrance steps, exclaiming over the surroundings with appropriate appreciation. The performance of appreciation seemed slightly more exaggerated this year, perhaps because they now knew the resort's owner would eventually witness their reactions. Around noon, James texted to inform me that all family members had checked in without incident. Uncle Dave and Aunt Ellen had been assigned the requested Cabin 8, a beautiful space, certainly, though not among the premium accommodations. My cousins Taylor and Megan were sharing Cabin 5 with Taylor's boyfriend Jason, while various other relatives were distributed through the remaining standard cabins. I decided to make my first appearance casual and unannounced. After changing into walking shoes, I took the scenic trail down to the lake, stopping to speak with groundskeepers and housekeeping staff along the way. These interactions weren't performative. I genuinely valued the insights of employees who experienced the property daily in ways management never could. Their observations had shaped many of our most successful operational improvements. As I approached the main beach area, I spotted several family groupings scattered across the sand and lounging in Adirondack chairs. Cousin Megan was attempting to position herself for what appeared to be a social media photo shoot, her husband looking bored as he held her phone at various angles. Uncle Dave and 3 male relatives had commandeered the horseshoe pits, their competitive shouts carrying across the water. Several others were gathered on the large dock, dangling feet in the lake. It was Taylor who noticed me first as I walked along the shoreline. She did a visible double take before nudging her boyfriend and whispering something that made him turn. Abruptly, like ripples in a pond, awareness of my presence spread across the beach, conversations pausing mid-sentence as heads turned in my direction. I continued my approach without altering my pace or demeanor, offering a simple wave and smile. Beautiful day, isn't it? How was everyone's check-in? The responses came with varying degrees of awkwardness and enthusiasm. Uncle Dave abandoned his horseshoe game to approach, hand extended in greeting. Jessica, didn't know you were already here. Everything's excellent, as always. There was a new note of deference in his tone that hadn't been present during our conversation at his birthday party. The reflectiveness he had shown then seemed overshadowed by a more calculated cordiality. I wondered whether his momentary vulnerability had been situational rather than transformative. Glad to hear it. I was just checking on the new landscaping along the shoreline. First summer season since we completed that project. More family members drifted toward us, creating an impromptu gathering. Questions came rapid fire, with notably different content than our previous family interactions. How long have you owned this place? Do you stay here often? Was the renovation complicated? How many properties does your company have? I answered politely, but without elaboration, neither hiding information nor offering the comprehensive business overview some clearly hoped for. This wasn't a networking event or investment pitch. It was supposedly a family gathering. Megan eventually cut through the business inquiries with characteristic directness. So are you joining the reunion activities this time? Mom spent weeks planning everything. The question highlighted the underlying uncertainty about my role in this gathering. Was I a resort owner checking on guests? A family member participating in the reunion? Both? Neither? I'm here primarily to spend time with Mom and Robert, I replied honestly. But I'll join some activities depending on my schedule. This response seemed to simultaneously relieve and disappoint various listeners. Some had clearly hoped I would maintain my distance, allowing the reunion to proceed without the complication of my now undeniable success. Others had expected me to fully immerse myself in family activities, perhaps seeking opportunities to establish new connections based on my changed status. I excused myself after a few minutes of general conversation, continuing my walk along the shoreline. Several younger cousins fell into step beside me, asking surprisingly thoughtful questions about the resort's environmental initiatives. Their genuine interest was refreshing after the awkward status recalibration with the older generation. The remainder of the afternoon passed quietly. I returned to my cabin to handle some work calls, then visited the resort's organic garden where the chef was selecting produce for the evening's dinner. These small, ordinary moments of business ownership felt grounding amid the subtle social tension of the family reunion. At 6 o'clock, I approached the Lakeside Pavilion where tables had been arranged for the welcome dinner. The setting sun cast golden light across the water, illuminating the space with a warm glow. Flower arrangements featuring native species decorated each table, and the chef had prepared a seasonal menu highlighting local ingredients. Conversation halted briefly as I entered, then resumed with slightly heightened volume. My mother waved from a table near the center where she sat with Robert and two of my friendlier aunts. I made my way toward them, exchanging greetings with various relatives en route. "You've created something truly special here," Robert said as I took the seat they'd saved beside them. "The staff can't stop talking about how much they enjoy working for Blue Summit. That says more than any amenity could." His observation touched me deeply. Building a business with strong ethical practices and employee satisfaction had always been central to my vision, but such values rarely featured in family assessments of success. "Thank you for noticing that," I replied. "It matters more than the profit margins, honestly." My mother squeezed my hand. "We're so proud of you. Not because of all this," she gestured around the beautiful pavilion, "but because of how you did it. On your terms, with integrity." Before I could respond, Aunt Ellen clinked her glass, calling for attention. As the self-appointed social director of family gatherings, she had clearly prepared remarks for the occasion. "Welcome, everyone, to our annual Miller family reunion. This year is particularly special, as we find ourselves in this magnificent setting thanks to our own Jessica." She gestured toward me with a smile that seemed genuine, if somewhat performative. "I think I speak for everyone when I say we're surprised and impressed by what you've built here, dear." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathering. I nodded acknowledgement, uncomfortable with becoming the focus of attention, but recognizing the need to accept this moment graciously. "In light of this unexpected connection," Aunt Ellen continued, "we've decided to adjust our traditional reunion schedule to include a special resort tour tomorrow morning, where Jessica can show us around her property and perhaps share some insights into her business journey." I blinked, caught off guard by this presumptuous planning. No one had consulted me about leading a tour or discussing my business journey. The assumption that I would naturally want to showcase my success to people who had previously dismissed me was both ironic and revealing. Before I could formulate a diplomatic response, Uncle Dave added his own amendment. "And perhaps we could use one of the meeting rooms afterward for an informal family business roundtable. I know several of us have projects that could benefit from Jessica's expertise." The transparent attempt to leverage my presence for consulting I hadn't offered left me momentarily speechless. After years of dismissing my career choices and financial acumen, they now wanted to centralize me as a resource, without ever acknowledging the dramatic shift in their assessment of my capabilities. My mother tensed beside me, clearly preparing to intervene, but I placed a hand gently on her arm. This was my boundary to establish. "Thank you for the thoughtful inclusion," I said, addressing Aunt Ellen directly. "However, I'm afraid I have prior commitments tomorrow morning that can't be rescheduled. James would be happy to arrange a standard resort tour with one of our excellent guides for anyone interested." I turned to Uncle Dave with a polite smile. "As for business discussions, I make it a policy not to mix family and financial advising. I can recommend several excellent consultants if anyone is seeking professional guidance." A beat of awkward silence followed as they absorbed the gentle but firm rejection. I maintained a pleasant expression, neither apologetic nor confrontational. "This was simply a reasonable boundary," stated clearly. Aunt Ellen recovered first. "Of course, dear. We shouldn't impose on your time. The regular tour sounds lovely." Dinner proceeded with a subtle but palpable shift in atmosphere. The initial attempts to center me as either a resource or spectacle had been redirected, creating space for more authentic interaction. Conversation gradually turned to typical family topics: health updates, children's activities, travel anecdotes, with notably less competitive undertones than usual. I found myself engaged in a surprisingly enjoyable discussion with cousins I had rarely connected with at previous gatherings. Without the burden of defending my perceived financial inadequacy, I was free to simply be present, contributing to conversations based on actual interests rather than status positioning. As dessert was being served, my cousin Taylor's boyfriend Jason approached, wine glass in hand. He had the practiced confidence of someone accustomed to networking in social settings. "Jessica, I've been hoping for a chance to speak with you," he began, taking the empty seat beside me without waiting for an invitation. "Taylor mentions you have a remarkable eye for undervalued properties. I'm actually exploring some investment opportunities that might interest you." I regarded him steadily. "What do you know about my investment criteria, Jason?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Well, I assume you're looking for strong returns, like any investor." "That's actually not my primary criterion," I replied. "I invest in properties where I can create both financial and community value, affordable housing that's actually beautiful, commercial spaces that serve neighborhood needs, developments that prioritize sustainability without passing those costs to tenants." His expression revealed his struggle to recalibrate his pitch. "That's admirable. But surely the bottom line matters too." "Of course it does. Sustainable business models require profitability. But not all profitable ventures create meaningful value beyond shareholder returns." I took a sip of water. "What community need does your opportunity address?" The pointed question clearly wasn't what he had anticipated. "It's more of a luxury development concept, targeting high-net-worth individuals looking for exclusive amenities." I nodded. "Sounds like you already know your target investor profile. I'm just..." "Not it." The exchange was observed by several family members with varying reactions. Some seemed embarrassed by Jason's transparent attempt to pitch me. Others appeared surprised by my clear articulation of investment principles that prioritized impact alongside returns. Taylor looked mortified, shooting her boyfriend a warning glance he failed to notice. "But the projected returns are exceptional," he persisted. "At least hear the full concept." "Jason," I said gently, "this isn't a business setting, and I'm not taking pitches tonight. I'm here as a family member, not a potential investor." My mother intervened smoothly, asking Jason about his recent trip to Portugal, effectively redirecting the conversation. He reluctantly took the cue, though his disappointment was evident. As the evening wound down, I found myself on the pavilion's edge, looking out over the moonlit lake. The water was perfectly still, reflecting stars like scattered diamonds across its surface. The beauty of this place never failed to center me, regardless of social complications. Uncle Dave appeared at my side, 2 glasses of whiskey in hand. The echo of our similar position at his birthday party wasn't lost on me. "Peace offering," he said, extending 1 glass. That was inappropriate of me earlier, suggesting the business roundtable without consulting you. I accepted the drink. With a nod. Thank you for recognizing that. We stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the night landscape. You've changed the dynamic, he finally said. Not by flaunting anything or demanding recognition, just by being exactly who you've always been, but visible now. The observation was surprisingly insightful coming from him. Is that uncomfortable? For you? He considered the question before answering. Honestly, yes. It challenges a lot of assumptions I've built my life around. He took a sip of whiskey. That conversation with Jason just now, you didn't dismiss his idea because it lacked profit potential. You dismissed it because it lacked purpose. Different values lead to different decisions, I said simply. The thing is, Jessica, I'm starting to question some of those values. His voice had the same reflective quality I'd heard at his birthday gathering. That health scare I mentioned made me realize I've spent decades accumulating wealth and status without ever really asking what it was all for, beyond having more than the next guy. This level of self-awareness seemed genuinely new for him. That's a significant realization. Seeing how you've built your success, the integration of financial and social returns, the lack of need for constant validation, it's making me reconsider some things. He gestured toward the gathered family, now dispersing toward their cabins. All this performance we do for each other, measuring worth by material markers. It's exhausting, isn't it? I nodded, surprised by his candor. It is. And ultimately empty. I've been thinking about legacy lately. What I'm actually leaving behind beyond accounts and assets. He turned to face me directly. Your mother mentioned you're helping them open a bookstore. Community-focused, she said. Yes. It's their dream, not mine. I'm just providing some financial and structural support. Would you be open to talking with me about something similar? Not tonight, not as a pitch. Just a conversation about meaningful investments. I have resources that could be redirected toward better purposes. The request seemed sincere rather than transactional. Not an attempt to leverage my expertise, but an expression of genuine interest in shifting priorities. I'd be open to that conversation, I agreed. Not as a family obligation, but as two adults with potentially aligned interests in community. Impact. Relief crossed his features. Thank you, that's more than fair. He finished his whiskey. You know, you're the only person in this family who's never tried to impress me. Even when we all just discovered you own the place we're standing in, you didn't use it to elevate your status. That's because I never needed your approval, Uncle Dave, I said without malice. My sense of worth wasn't dependent on your assessment. He laughed softly. Probably the healthiest approach to this family anyone's ever taken. As we parted ways for the evening, I reflected on the unexpected turn our relationship had taken. Not a dramatic reconciliation or complete transformation, but a small opening towards something potentially authentic. It reminded me that people can change, not usually in sudden conversions, but in gradual recalibrations prompted by disrupted assumptions and new perspectives. The next morning, I met my mother and Robert for breakfast at the resort's farm-to-table restaurant. They arrived looking refreshed and content, clearly enjoying their status as regular guests rather than awkward relatives of the owner. The family's buzzing about last night, my mother reported with a hint of satisfaction. Your boundaries around the tour and business roundtable made quite an impression. I wasn't trying to make a statement, I said, buttering a piece of toast. Just being clear about what I'm comfortable with. That clarity is exactly what's remarkable, Robert observed. Most people in this family navigate relationships through carefully calibrated obligations and expectations. Your straightforward boundaries disrupted that entire system. My mother nodded agreement. Ellen was actually flustered. I don't think anyone's ever politely declined one of her social directives before. I had to smile at that characterization. How are you both enjoying the reunion so far? It's strange, my mother admitted. There's a different energy this year. Less competitive, showing off more actual conversation. Even Megan asked about our bookstore plans with what seemed like genuine interest. Speaking of which, Robert interjected, we found the perfect name yesterday while sitting on our deck. Sunrise Pages. What do you think? I love it, I said sincerely. It captures the feeling of new beginnings and quiet possibility. We spent the next hour discussing their vision for the store, from reading Nook designs to community event programming. Their enthusiasm was contagious, their ideas thoughtful and aligned with genuine community needs. This project clearly represented not just a business, but a meaningful third act in their lives. As we were finishing breakfast, several family members approached our table, including cousins I had rarely spoken with at previous gatherings. They asked about joining the regular resort tour James had arranged, then surprised me with an invitation. We're taking the kayaks out to the Hidden Cove this afternoon, my cousin Daniel said. Nothing formal, just exploring. Would you join us? You probably know all the best spots on the lake. The invitation seemed genuinely social, rather than an attempt to extract insider knowledge or special treatment. I found myself agreeing with unexpected enthusiasm. I'd like that. There's a beautiful eagle nest on the far shore I've been monitoring. The day unfolded with a natural rhythm that felt remarkably different from previous family gatherings. I joined various activities when they appealed to me, declined others without explanation or apology, and found myself engaged in conversations that went beyond surface pleasantries or status signaling. During the kayak excursion, I shared stories about the lake's ecological restoration projects, pointing out evidence of returning native species. My cousins responded with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about environmental impact and sustainability practices. One even mentioned volunteering with a local conservation group, seeking my perspective on their effectiveness. These interactions weren't dramatic breakthroughs or complete relationship transformations. They were simply small moments of authentic connection, people finding common ground beyond the narrow metrics that had previously defined our family hierarchy. By the final evening of the reunion, a subtle but significant shift had occurred in the collective dynamic. The performance of status hadn't disappeared entirely. Decades of ingrained behavior don't vanish overnight, but it had been tempered by new possibilities for interaction. Some family members still struggled to see beyond material markers of success, while others seemed genuinely interested in exploring different values. The farewell dinner was held in the main lodge's grand dining room, tables arranged in a large U-shape to facilitate conversation. As people took their seats, I noticed my position had been carefully arranged between my mother and Uncle Dave, with Aunt Ellen directly across. The placement of someone now recognized as a family cornerstone, rather than a peripheral member. Throughout the meal, I observed the varying responses to my changed status with curious detachment. Some relatives had simply updated their assessment of me within the existing value system. I had moved from unsuccessful to successful, while the measuring stick remained unchanged. Others seemed to be questioning the measuring stick itself, reconsidering what truly constituted a life well lived. Near the end of dinner, Aunt Ellen tapped her glass for attention. Before we all depart tomorrow, I want to thank Jessica not just for this beautiful venue, but for giving us something unexpected this weekend, a new perspective. Her typically rehearsed delivery held a note of genuine reflection. I think many of us have realized we've been measuring success rather narrowly for a very long time. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table. Uncle Dave nodded thoughtfully. Several cousins exchanged meaningful glances. To Jessica, Aunt Ellen continued, raising her glass. Not for what she owns, but for who she is. Something we should have valued long before we knew about this place. The toast felt like a small but significant acknowledgement, not just of my success, but of the flawed values that had prevented them from seeing it sooner. As glasses were raised around the table, I felt neither vindication nor triumph, but a quiet recognition that perhaps some healing was possible, even in a family long governed by superficial metrics. After dinner, I walked along the lake shore, with my mother and Robert, watching the sunset paint the sky in spectacular hues of orange and pink. The beauty of this place never failed to center me, reminding me why I had invested in it beyond financial considerations. "What do you think?" my mother asked as we paused on the dock. "Has anything really changed?" I considered the question carefully. Some things have. Some people are genuinely reconsidering their values. Others have simply reclassified me within the same flawed system. Real change is rarely universal or complete. Robert nodded. "The important thing is that you remained exactly who you've always been throughout all of it. Authentic, purposeful, clear about your values." "That's the real success story here," my mother added. "Not that you proved them wrong about your financial capability, but that you never needed their validation to begin with." As we stood watching darkness settle over the lake, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. From being excluded from a family reunion for perceived financial inadequacy to hosting that same reunion at a property I owned, the situation contained a certain poetic justice. But the true victory wasn't in that external irony. The real triumph was in the internal journey, learning to define success on my own terms, building a life aligned with my values rather than others' expectations, and finding peace in being exactly who I was, whether seen or unseen by those around me. The family that had once banned me from their gathering for being poor had indeed changed their assessment once they learned I owned the venue. Some now sought connection for transactional purposes, others out of genuine recalibration of values. I would navigate each relationship individually, maintaining boundaries where necessary and opening to authenticity where possible. But regardless of how these family dynamics continued to evolve, I would move forward as I always had, guided by purpose rather than approval, measuring success by impact rather than accumulation, and finding worth in who I was rather than what I owned. The greatest freedom, after all, wasn't in proving others wrong. It was in no longer needing to prove anything at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.